My name is Dr. Bart Thorne. On October 14th, 2024, I was 42 years old, living in a sterile, high-rise apartment in downtown Seattle. I was a senior research lead in molecular oncology, a man who spent his life quantifying the invisible. To me, the world was a series of predictable chemical reactions and biological imperatives. I didn't have a spiritual life because I didn't see a line item for it in the human genome. That morning started with a crushing pressure in my substernal region. Not the sharp, cinematic pain of a heart attack, but a heavy, dull ache that felt like someone was standing on my chest with a lead boot. I ignored it. I took 2 aspirin and drove to the lab, thinking it was just the stress of the quarterly funding review. I remember sitting at my desk, looking at a petri dish under the microscope, watching the way a specific protein strand was folding. Then, the room tilted. The fluorescent lights didn't just flicker. They seemed to hum at a frequency that vibrated inside my teeth. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like they were made of water. My assistant, Sarah, walked in with a stack of reports and her face instantly drained of color. She dropped the papers. I remember the sound of them hitting the floor like a deck of cards shuffling, and she caught me just as my forehead hit the edge of the mahogany desk. I felt the warm slip of blood against my skin, and then the world narrowed down to a single, pulsing point of light. I wasn't scared. I was annoyed. I was thinking about the data I hadn't backed up. I was thinking about the dinner reservation I'd have to cancel. The last thing I heard was the high-pitched whine of the building's security alarm, tripped by Sarah's frantic exit to find the floor medic. My heart didn't stop with a bang. It just grew tired of the rhythm. The transition from the lab floor to the emergency room at Harborview Medical Center felt like a series of disjointed frames in a film. I was vaguely aware of the paramedics, the smell of cheap latex, and the rhythmic, mechanical thud of the chest compression device. I heard the term ventricular fibrillation. In my head, I was analyzing it. My heart was quivering like a bag of worms instead of pumping blood. I felt the cold shock of the defibrillator paddles, a massive jolt that felt like being hit by a freight train, yet I remained curiously detached. Suddenly, the perspective shifted. I wasn't looking out of my eyes anymore. I was looking down from the corner of the ceiling, right near the HVAC vent. I saw myself. I looked gray, almost translucent under the harsh hospital LEDs. I saw the lead attending physician, a man I'd shared coffee with 3 weeks prior, shouting for another round of epinephrine. I saw the way my shirt had been cut open, the jagged edges of the fabric looking pathetic and small. The medical realism was suffocating. I watched the nurse struggle with a blown vein in my left arm, the blood pooling on the white tile floor in a shape that looked like a map of a country I didn't recognize. There was no tunnel of light yet, just the profound silence of a room filled with people screaming. I realized then that my consciousness wasn't tied to my gray matter. My brain was clinically dead, the EEG flatlining on the monitor I could clearly see from my vantage point, yet I was thinking more clearly than I ever had in the lab. I noticed a small, forgotten penny under the crash cart, dated 1994. I wondered why I was noticing a penny when my life was ending. It was the first crack in my materialist armor, the realization that I was still I, even without a pulse. The walls of the hospital didn't fade, they simply ceased to matter. One moment I was hovering over the frantic scramble of a code blue, and the next, the hospital was a memory. I wasn't in heaven, at least not the one from the postcards. I was in a place that felt like the absolute edge of a vast, silent ocean at night. There was no wind, no temperature, just an overwhelming sense of presence. It was dense. The air, if you can call it that, felt like it was made of information. Then he was there. I didn't see a bearded man in a robe. I saw a figure that was defined by a terrifying, beautiful clarity. He stood in a way that made the vacuum around him feel crowded. He looked like a man, but the light coming off him wasn't reflected. It was generated from within, a soft, amber glow that made my own spirit feel dim and dusty. He didn't say a word at first. He just looked at me, and in that look, every lie I'd ever told myself about my own goodness and my objectivity evaporated. I felt the weight of my intellectual pride, the way I had used science as a shield to keep from ever having to be vulnerable. The silence stretched until it was unbearable, a physical pressure more intense than the heart attack. Then he spoke. His voice didn't travel through ears. It resonated in the marrow of my non-existent bones. He didn't ask about my sins or my degrees. He didn't mention the lab or the money. He looked directly into the center of my being and asked the one question that the title of my life had been avoiding. He asked, "What did you do with the love I put in your hands?" Before I could formulate a defensive, academic response, the environment began to shift again, the amber light turning into a searing, uncomfortable gold. The question didn't just hang in the air. It vibrated through the fabric of my entire history. What did you do with the love I put in your hands? I wanted to talk about my publications. I wanted to tell him about the protein strands I'd mapped and the lives my research might eventually save through oncology. But as I opened my mouth, or the essence of what I was, the words turned to ash. In that light, my achievements looked like a collection of shiny pebbles a child collects on a beach. They were cold. They were dead. He wasn't looking for my resume. He was looking for a specific frequency of warmth that I realized, with a sickening jolt, I had systematically stifled. I saw a flash of my ex-wife, Elena. I saw the night I had stayed at the lab until 3:00 a.m., not because the experiment was at a critical juncture, but because I didn't want to deal with her grief over her father's passing. I had chosen the sterile, controllable environment of the microscope over the messy, unpredictable demand of her tears. I saw the love he was talking about. It was a tangible substance I had been given, a currency of the soul, and I had buried it under layers of intellectual ego and professional distancing. He didn't look angry. That was the worst part. He looked like a father looking at a son who had thrown away a priceless heirloom because he thought it was a common rock. The amber light intensified, and suddenly, the warning began to manifest. It wasn't a voice from the clouds. It was a sudden, jarring vision of my own apartment, 3 days into the future. I saw the mail piling up. I saw a specific blue envelope from the university's legal department. I saw the beginning of a fracture that wasn't just personal, but institutional. "If you return," he said, and the "if" felt like a heavy stone, "you will see the harvest of the coldness you sowed." The transition back toward the physical realm was agonizing. It felt like being pulled through a narrow glass tube. One moment I was in that vast, amber presence, and the next, I was hovering back in the ICU. The warning had shifted from a spiritual concept to a cold, hard reality. I saw my brother, Mark, sitting in the waiting room. We hadn't spoken in 4 years because of a dispute over our mother's estate. A dispute I had won using a high-priced lawyer and a ruthless application of contract law. Mark looked older, his hair thinning, his hands shaking as he held a plastic cup of hospital coffee. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in decades. Pure, unadulterated shame. The warning wasn't about the afterlife. It was about the now. The presence of Jesus had made it clear that my return wasn't a reward, but a reckoning. I saw the blue envelope again, the one from my vision. It was sitting on my kitchen counter in the future I was being shown. I recognized the return address, Office of Research Integrity. My heart, my physical heart, which was currently being kept alive by a machine, seemed to skip even in its dormant state. Someone at the lab had flagged my latest data set. They were accusing me of optimizing results to secure the next 5-year grant. It was a lie, mostly, but I knew I had rounded up. I had let my ambition blur the lines of my precious objectivity. I realized then that my entire life was a house of cards, and the wind was starting to blow. The social tension I had ignored was boiling over. My colleagues weren't my friends. They were predators waiting for a scent of blood, and I had given them a gallon of it. The light from the other side began to fade, replaced by the rhythmic, soul-crushing beep of the hospital monitors. I wasn't fully back in my body yet, but I was tethered to it. A nurse walked in, a woman named Denise. I saw it on her badge. She looked exhausted. She was checking the 4-drip, and I saw her pause. She looked at my face, then she looked at the door to make sure no one was watching. She reached out and lightly touched my hand. Not a medical touch, but a human one. She whispered a prayer, something soft and desperate. In that moment, I felt the love Jesus had asked about. It was right there, in her tired fingers, and I was a man who had never prayed for anyone in my life. But then, the fracture hit. My phone, sitting on the bedside table in a plastic patient belongings bag, lit up with a text message. I could see it clearly from my hovering perspective. It was from Elena. It said, "Eris, I heard you're in the hospital. I'm not coming. I can't do this again. Please don't have them call me." The rejection was a physical blow. It was the harvest I had been warned about. My pursuit of cold, hard facts had left me in a room where the only person who cared if I lived or died was a stranger on a double shift who didn't even know my middle name. I felt the financial and social walls closing in. The university was already moving to freeze my lab access. I saw a notification on the phone screen for an emergency board meeting regarding my department. My life's work, my reputation, my marriage, it was all disintegrating simultaneously. The warning was no longer a vision. It was a lived catastrophe. I was being sent back to a ruins of my own making. The hospital room didn't just feel cold, it felt morally empty. As my consciousness began to fuse back into my physical nerves, the amber light flared one last time, pulling me into a space that felt like a quiet, high-walled garden in the middle of a storm. Jesus was there again. He wasn't looking at the monitors or the 4 bags. He was looking at the text from Elena on my phone, which seemed to float between us like a suspended shard of glass. I felt a surge of defensive anger. I wanted to explain that Elena didn't understand the pressure of the grants, that the university was cutthroat, that I had to be cold to survive. He silenced me without lifting a finger. "You built a temple to yourself," he said, and the words felt like they were being etched into my ribcage. "And now you are surprised that you are the only one inside it." He walked closer, and the explanation for the title of my life began to unfold with brutal clarity. He told me that the question, "What did you do with the love I put in your hands?" was the only metric that determined the architecture of a soul's home after the body fails. He explained that most people spend their lives collecting proof of their existence, titles, bank balances, arguments won, but that none of that carries a charge in the realm of the spirit. "The outcome of a life," he said, "is determined by the weight of the mercy you gave away." He told me that the reason my world was collapsing, the university investigation, the broken marriage, the isolation, was because I had reached the limit of my own self-sufficiency. I had run out of heiress, and there was nothing else left. He stood before me, not as a judge with a gavel, but as a mirror. He showed me that the warning wasn't just about my personal failures. It was about a specific choice I had to make upon my return. He spoke about the social fracture I was seeing in my vision. The way people were turning on each other in the world outside the hospital. "The world is growing cold," he said, "because men like you believe that truth is found in a microscope instead of a heartbeat." He gave me a direct choice. I could return to my body and fight the university, use my legal team to crush the whistleblowers, and spend my remaining years bitter and right. Or I could accept the total loss of my reputation as the price for a heart that actually worked. He told me that if I chose the latter, I would lose my lab, my funding, and my status in the scientific community. I would be a disgraced doctor in the eyes of the world, but I would finally be able to answer his question. He showed me a vision of a small, cramped apartment, not my penthouse, but a place with mismatched furniture and a smell of cheap floor cleaner. I was sitting there, and I was holding a phone, and I was listening to someone else's pain without trying to fix it or quantify it. The choice felt like a death in itself. To a man like me, being unimportant was worse than being dead. The tension in the garden was absolute. The amber light began to pulse with the rhythm of my failing heart down in the ICU, demanding an answer. I didn't say yes with a grand gesture. I said it with a sob that felt like it was tearing my chest open. The moment I surrendered my pride, the garden vanished. The transition back was violent, a sickening, wet thud as my consciousness slammed into my ribcage. I felt the intubation tube down my throat, the gag reflex screaming, the taste of blood and plastic. I heard a muffled, "He's back. We have a rhythm," and the chaotic scuffle of medical boots on the floor. The pain was astronomical. Every nerve ending was on fire, a stark contrast to the weightless peace of the amber light. I lay there, unable to move, staring at the perforated tiles of the hospital ceiling. A doctor I didn't recognize leaned over me, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "Welcome back, Dr. Thorne," he said, but his voice sounded hollow. I looked past him, toward the patient belongings bag on the nightstand. I could see the corner of my phone through the plastic. I knew the text from Elena was there. I knew the emails from the university were waiting. The direct confrontation hadn't ended in the garden. It was just beginning in the physical world. I felt a profound sense of grief. I was alive, but the heiress Thorne, who had walked into the lab that morning, was gone. I was a stranger in my own skin, trapped in a life that was about to be dismantled piece by piece. As they wheeled me toward the ICU, I saw the nurse, Denise. She looked relieved, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. She just kept looking at the monitors, as if she were afraid of what she had prayed for. The transition from the ICU to a regular recovery floor was less a progression and more a demotion. By the third day, the hospital room felt like a holding cell. I was sitting up, the stitches on my forehead a jagged reminder of the lab floor, when my attorney, Marcus, walked in. He didn't bring flowers. He brought a leather briefcase and a look of profound discomfort. He didn't even sit down. "Eris," he started, his voice flat, "the university has officially placed you on administrative leave. They've locked your lab. They've seized your hard drives." I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to argue. I saw the social tension Jesus had warned me about. The way the people who had toasted my successes only months ago were now stepping back, afraid the stain of my investigation would rub off on them. Marcus told me that the whistleblowers weren't just disgruntled students. It was my own lead researcher, a man I had mentored for 6 years. He had documented every time I'd smoothed a curve to fit a hypothesis. The public fallout was starting. A local news blog had already picked up the story of the oncology star's fall from grace. I watched Marcus speak, but I was seeing the Amber Garden. I realized that the love I had failed to give was now being withheld from me by the very world I had tried to conquer. My reputation wasn't a shield, it was a target. I felt the financial weight, too. The legal fees alone would drain my liquid assets in months. I was being stripped, layer by layer, just as the vision had shown. A week later, I was back in my high-rise apartment. It felt like a museum of a dead man. The silence was deafening. I sat at my mahogany desk, the same one I'd hit during my collapse, and looked at the blue envelope that had been waiting in my mail, the exact one from my vision. It was a formal summons. I had 72 hours to respond to the allegations or face immediate termination and a referral to the state board. I could fight. I had the data to obfuscate theirs. I could make it a he said, she said battle that would last years. But then, I remembered the question. What did you do with the love I put in your hands? I looked at my phone. I called Elena. It went to voicemail, of course. I didn't leave a message about the house or the money or the legalities. I just said, I finally understand why you left. You were right. I was a cold man. I hung up, my hands shaking. The personal choice was here. I opened my laptop and began to type, not a defense, but a full, unvarnished admission. I detailed every optimized result, every shortcut, every time I had prioritized my ego over the integrity of the science. I felt a strange, terrifying lightness as I hit send. I was choosing the small, cramped apartment from the vision. I was choosing to be nothing in the eyes of Seattle's elite, so I could finally be something in the eyes of the one who had asked the question. The social fracture was complete. By morning, I would be a pariah. 2 months later, I was living in a rental in a part of the city I used to avoid. The irreversible grounded event happened on a Tuesday. I was at a small community clinic, volunteering to file charts, the only work I could get while my license was under review. I walked past a television in the waiting room and saw a news report. The university had officially announced that my entire protein folding project was being scrapped. All the progress I thought I had made was gone. It was as if I had never existed in that world. I sat down on a plastic chair, feeling the weight of the loss, when a woman sat next to me. She was crying softly, holding a folder of medical results. In the old days, I would have looked away, annoyed by the emotional display. But I remembered the nurse, Denise, and her prayer. I reached out. I didn't have a cure for her. I didn't have a scientific explanation. I just put my hand on her shoulder, a human touch, clumsy and new. "I'm here," I said. "I'm listening." As I did, I felt a faint, familiar warmth in the center of my chest. Not a heart attack, but a resonance. I looked down at my hand on her sleeve and noticed a small, dark stain on my thumb. It was a chemical burn from the lab that had never fully healed, a permanent mark of the man I used to be. The warning was real. The fall was total. I looked at the flickering fluorescent light of the clinic, so different from the amber glow of the garden, and I realized I was finally starting to answer the question. The world was cold, but my hands, for the first time, were not.